Fashion is, and always has been, one of the most perpetually controversial topics in the Western world. It has a powerful effect in shaping our social lives, especially when we are still young and responsive. But no one can quite hope to escape its influence, except in very minor ways. At the most, some are a little in advance, and some are a little behind it. Its bondage begins in the cradle. Babies have always been obliged to follow fashion, sometimes to their very great discomfort. Their dresses are nearly as easy to date as those of adults. Christening robes are often handed down, but when a baby gets new clothes, they are sure to be up to date. Babies' fashions have changed even more than those of nannies, and even more than those of mammas, not to speak of papas. Yes, it all begins in the cradle, or perhaps we should say at the font, where our first formal clothes are generally worn. The long gowns of babies were created in an entirely anti-practical spirit. The principle on which all ceremonial clothing is designed, to show that the wearer is important enough to command material, craftsmanship, and labor. The purpose of the trailing white robe is simply to make the baby look important. So it uses up much more material than it really needs. The embroidery has consumed weeks of somebody's work, and being easily crumpled and soiled, it shows at a glance that labor is employed to keep it looking right. The long gown of the baby is paralleled by the long train of the bride. Any extension or expansion of the costume, unless it's carried to the point of absurdity, always suggests importance. The baby's embroidery, needing so much workmanship, may in later life become this kind of thing: gold bullion thread adorning the bosom of a privy councillor, the spotless white that must be washed every time it's worn, once obligatory for babies, lights the way to the dress for a garden party or a race meeting, which so obviously takes hours to do up. The occasions in life which are intended to be memorable are all signalized by clothes. Clothes that are planned to call attention to us, to call attention to our joy, to our high spirits, to our grief, or to our glory. You may think that such highly ceremonial clothing as this, the robes of a British peer and peeress worn at the coronation of the reigning queen, ought not to come into a discussion of the workings of fashion. But most ceremonial dress, even the oldest, is simply based on a fashion that has failed to move on, has petrified, in fact. The Countess of Huntingdon is wearing something very near what could have been worn in any grand home in the early 1700s, when velvet in sumptuous colour, trimmed with fur and opening over a rich petticoat, was everyday wear for fine ladies. The peer's robe is in a style of much greater antiquity. It goes back to fashionable male clothing in the 13th century. The greater the dignity of the wearer, the longer the train. That's a recognized rule of formal dress. Naturally, the trains of kings and queens are the longest of all. Why does formal dress turn into ceremonial dress? Why do certain fashions petrify? This happens whenever it's felt that strict rules and regulations are needed to show what's what and who's who. The ranks of the nobility can be seen at a glance by the powdering, the black spots symbolic of ermine tails on their capes. 2 rows for a baron, 2.5 for a viscount, and so on. The British are particularly fond of knowing what's what and who's who, and so they have ceremonial dress that some countries have abandoned. It wouldn't do to mistake a doctor of law for an undergraduate, if such a thing were possible. So here are clothes which clearly distinguish one from another, clothes that are built on memories of gowns once fashionable. Ceremonial dress is generally highly symbolical, though some of it goes back so far in history that hardly anyone has known for centuries what some of the symbols stand for. Why do the highest ranks of the peerage rejoice in strawberry leaves, as we see on this marquis's coronet? Why are there 16 small silver balls, known as pearls, on the coronet of a viscount? Why 7 large ones for a baron? The answer has been lost, as they say, in the mists of antiquity. But here are relics more easily explained. The long sleeves, lined with contrasting material, were once the last word in gentlemen's tailoring. The hood really belongs to medieval times, when college buildings were freezingly cold, and any contrivance was welcome that would protect the head and neck from icy draughts. And hoods are still retained, although they are now never used. Now, here's another symbol, or perhaps I should say the symbol of a symbol. The 3 feathers, which are the emblem in heraldry of the Prince of Wales, were worn until the outbreak of the last war by all ladies going to court. That became the fixed rule when the eldest son of George III, afterwards Prince Regent, was getting into his stride as the first gentleman in Europe. In the 1790s, ostrich feathers in the hair were in any case the mode, and it was a pretty compliment to the prince to deck the head with 3 of them. At first they were very tall and worn at the front of the head, and the style was optional, merely a fashion. Later it crystallized into a formality. Before that, at the English court, as well as the French and elsewhere, the headdress had to be finished off with lappets, dangling ends of fine lace that fell onto the shoulders.